The Hargrove estate sat at the edge of Lake Meridian like something conjured from a dream. 12,000 square feet of marble floors, cathedral ceilings, and glass walls that caught the morning light and turned it into something almost sacred. From the outside, people driving along the private road would slow their cars just to stare, their faces pressed briefly toward the passenger windows before the iron gates disappeared in their rear-view mirrors. They imagined champagne breakfasts and laughter echoing through grand halls. They imagined a life without edges. They didn't imagine Lily Santos at 5:30 in the morning, already on her knees in the East Corridor with a bucket of pine-scented water and a mop handle that had been repaired twice with electrical tape. They didn't imagine her counting hours in her head, not because she was bored, but because every hour translated to a dollar amount, and every dollar amount translated to a very specific calculation involving her daughter's daycare, the back rent she owed her landlord, and the inhaler prescription that insurance had partially covered last month.
Partially.
That word lived in her chest like a splinter. Lily was 28 years old, and she had the kind of beauty that didn't know itself. Dark eyes that caught the light when she was thinking hard about something, a smile she reserved carefully, the way people reserve things they know are valuable. She'd come to the United States from the Philippines 8 years ago with her mother's blessing, her grandmother's rosary, and a fierce, unbreakable belief that if she worked hard enough, if she gave enough of herself to this country, it would eventually hold her gently in return. She'd gotten her papers in order. She'd taken every cleaning job she could find. She'd learned to be invisible in rich people's homes, to move through their spaces like a gentle wind, present, necessary, and never quite seen. Then came Sophia. Sophia had arrived 2 years ago in a burst of noise and need that had rearranged every atom of Lily's existence. Her daughter, 23 inches long, a full head of dark hair, and lungs that could apparently be heard from the hospital parking lot, had not been planned. Sophia's father had not stayed. That was a chapter Lily had closed firmly, not with bitterness, but with a kind of exhausted practicality. She didn't have time for bitterness. Bitterness was a luxury, like long baths and sleeping past 6. What she had was Sophia. Sophia with the round cheeks and the serious brown eyes that studied everything like she was taking notes for a very important exam. Sophia, who at 2 years old had not yet said a single word, not mama, not no, not the simple animal sounds other toddlers produced with cheerful casualness. Lily had taken her to the pediatrician twice, and the doctor had smiled that careful, measured smile and said some children simply took longer, that Sophia was clearly alert, clearly engaged, clearly absorbing everything around her. She just hadn't decided to speak yet. Lily understood this in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Sophia watched. Sophia waited. Sophia was, in this way, more like her mother than Lily had realized. The position at the Hargrove estate had come through an agency 3 months ago, full-time, live-in during the weekdays, with a private room in the East Wing where, after some careful negotiation and a moment of held breath, Lily had been permitted to bring Sophia. The arrangement was unusual. The woman who ran the house, who owned approximately 40% of a tech company that had changed the way hospitals managed patient data, had apparently agreed to the child without hesitation. The agency coordinator had seemed almost surprised when she relayed this. Ms. Hargrove said, and I'm quoting directly here, the coordinator had told Lily over the phone, that children make houses less lonely. She said yes immediately. Lily had filed that detail away without attaching too much meaning to it. Employers said things. Rich people especially said things, generous, expansive things that sounded like philosophy, and sometimes meant very little when pressed against actual daily life. She had learned not to build expectations on the foundations of other people's words. But then she had met Alexandra Hargrove. Alexandra was 33, and she walked into rooms the way lightning crosses a sky, sudden, illuminating, impossible to ignore, and yet somehow leaving you uncertain afterward whether you'd really seen it at all. She was tall. With auburn hair she kept pulled back in a knot that was always slightly imperfect, like she'd done it herself without a mirror and hadn't cared enough to check. She wore expensive clothes the way some people wear old sweaters, like they didn't particularly matter, like they were just the layer between her and the world. Her eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that changed depending on the light, and Lily would come to understand, depending on her mood. She was, by any measurable definition, extraordinary. She held 2 patents. She sat on the board of 3 nonprofits. She had been on the cover of Fortune magazine at 31 with a headline that read, "The Woman Who Made Healthcare Human Again." She had, by all accounts, accomplished more in a decade than most people accomplished in a lifetime. She also ate cereal for dinner when she forgot to ask the housekeeper to prepare something. She left notes to herself on post-its stuck to the bathroom mirror. She kept a worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit on her nightstand, not as a display, but visibly read, its spine broken in 3 places. And in the 3 months Lily had worked in this house, she had never once seen Alexandra Hargrove have a personal phone call that wasn't about business. Not one. No laughter from behind a closed door. No visits from friends. No evidence of a life that existed outside the boundaries of the work that had made her famous. The estate had 8 bedrooms. Alexandra used 1. The rest stood perfectly made, perfectly clean, perfectly empty. Lily noticed these things because noticing was her nature, and because she had learned, long before she ever set foot in this country, that the architecture of loneliness looked different depending on how much money surrounded it. In small apartments, loneliness looked like bare refrigerators and lights left on all night. In places like this, it looked like abundance. It looked like rooms that had never been lived in and books that had been read 100 times and a woman who said yes immediately when asked if a child could come, because children make houses less lonely, and then went back to her office and worked until midnight every single night. On the morning that would change everything, Lily arrived at 6 a.m. as always, Sophia balanced on her left hip, the diaper bag on her right shoulder. The kitchen was quiet. The espresso machine light blinked ready. Outside, the lake was perfectly still, silver in the early light, and a single heron stood at the edge of the water like it was considering something important. Lily set Sophia down on the kitchen floor with a board book and a soft elephant toy. She began preparing the coffee. And then the door opened, and Alexandra Hargrove walked in wearing yesterday's clothes, with dark circles under her gray-green eyes and the particular look of someone who had been awake all night not because she wanted to be, but because the silence had simply refused to let her go. She stopped when she saw Sophia. Sophia looked up from her elephant, and something passed between them, something quiet and unplanned and entirely outside the boundaries of employer and employee and all the careful invisible lines that Lily had spent 3 months faithfully observing. Something that morning had begun. There is a particular kind of quiet that exists in large houses before the rest of the world wakes up, not the absence of sound, but a fullness of it. The refrigerator's gentle hum. The settling of old wood, the soft movement of air through rooms that have been breathed in and out by the same lungs for so many years that the house itself seems to have developed a respiratory rhythm. Lily had come to love this hour. It was the one part of the day that felt entirely unhurried, the 1 hour that didn't owe anything to anyone. She had learned, in those first weeks, to move through Alexandra's kitchen with the specific care of someone who understood that this space was not just a place where food was prepared. It was the one room in the house where Alexandra actually paused. Every other room had a purpose that kept her in motion, the home office where she spent 8 to 12 hours a day, the gym where she worked through problems on the treadmill, the dining room she used as overflow desk space and hadn't eaten at in what Lily estimated to be months. But the kitchen in the morning was different. Alexandra came here and stood at the counter and held her coffee with both hands and looked out at the lake, and for approximately 11 minutes, she simply existed. Lily had timed it once, not intentionally, but because she was observant and patterns revealed themselves to observant people whether they sought them or not. 11 minutes. Every morning. Just standing and looking and breathing. Lily had said nothing about this observation. It was not her business. Her business was the coffee, the floors, the laundry, the surfaces. Her business was the careful maintenance of the invisible boundary that made this arrangement function. But Sophia did not understand invisible boundaries. Sophia, at 2 years old, operated on a system of pure instinct and unfiltered curiosity that had no regard whatsoever for appropriate professional distance. She noticed Alexandra during that first kitchen morning, and from that point forward, she watched her with the focused intensity she normally reserved for birds outside the window, and the particular episode of her favorite cartoon show involving a purple dinosaur who could apparently also bake. Every morning when Alexandra stood at the counter with her coffee and her 11 minutes of lake staring, Sophia would position herself nearby, not right next to her, not immediately underfoot, but within observing distance, and she would study this tall, quiet woman with the serious eyes and the slightly imperfect hair as though she were a very fascinating and somewhat puzzling natural phenomenon. Alexandra, for her part, had made no move to discourage this. She had also made no move to engage it. She acknowledged Sophia's presence with the occasional glance downward, something between awareness and uncertainty, like someone who had been handed a gift in a language they hadn't yet learned to read. She didn't ignore the child. But she didn't quite know what to do with her either, and that not knowing lived visibly on her face in a way that Lily found unexpectedly moving. Because Alexandra Hargrove was not a woman who visibly didn't know things. That was perhaps the most striking thing about her, not the intelligence or the accomplishment or the money, but the particular quality of self-possession she carried in every interaction Lily had witnessed. She moved through her world with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to convert uncertainty into competence. She knew how to run a company. She knew how to speak to boards and investors and senators and journalists. She knew how to make hard decisions in seconds and live with them afterward without visible flinching. She had answers. She had frameworks. She had, Lily suspected, a protocol for nearly every conceivable professional situation. She did not, apparently, have a protocol for a 2-year-old who watched her with enormous solemn eyes and offered her, one Tuesday morning, a slightly chewed-on corner of a graham cracker. Lily had been at the sink when it happened. She'd heard the small shuffling sound of Sophia crossing the kitchen floor and turned just in time to see her daughter extending one small fist toward Alexandra, the graham cracker fragment held up like a very serious and important gift. Alexandra had looked down at it, then at Sophia, then at the cracker again. A pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but contained within it something Lily couldn't fully name. Then Alexandra had crouched down, all 6 feet of her, expensive trousers and all, and accepted the piece of graham cracker from Sophia's hand with both of hers, as though it were something fragile and significant. "Thank you," she'd said quietly. And Sophia had nodded once, satisfied, and toddled back to her elephant. Lily had turned back to the sink so Alexandra wouldn't see her face. She had a policy about her face. She kept it professional. She kept it pleasant. She did not let it reflect the things she noticed and filed away, because noticing too much was a form of intimacy that did not belong in this particular space. But that morning at the sink, alone with the sound of running water, she'd allowed herself one moment of something warm and unguarded. Because she had watched Alexandra Hargrove receive a crumbled piece of graham cracker from a toddler as though she'd been handed something precious. And the expression on her face as she'd straightened back up, before the professional composure had slid back into place like a second skin, had been something Lily recognized from her own mirror. It was the face of a person who had not been offered something small and genuine in a very, very long time. The mornings continued. The pattern shifted imperceptibly, the way weather shifts, not in single dramatic moments, but in gradual degrees that you only notice after enough time has passed to give you perspective. Alexandra began finishing her 11 minutes at the counter slightly later. She began positioning herself, just barely, at an angle that made her more visible to Sophia's corner of the kitchen. She started keeping a box of animal crackers on the lower shelf of the pantry, which Lily noticed because it was her job to notice such things, and because animal crackers had definitely not been on the previous grocery list. She said nothing. She ordered the animal crackers when she did the weekly shopping. She put them on the lower shelf where Sophia could see them, and she said nothing about any of it. One morning in the 4th week, Lily came in to find a single stuffed animal, a small cloth bear with a red ribbon, sitting beside the elephant on the kitchen floor in Sophia's corner. There was no note, no explanation. Lily made the coffee, and when Alexandra came in 7 minutes later, neither of them said a word about it. Sophia picked up the bear immediately, examined it with her characteristic seriousness, and then held it against her chest with both arms in the particular way she held things she intended to keep. This was also the week Lily began to notice that Alexandra's 12-hour workdays had started to end slightly earlier. By 7 instead of midnight, sometimes. She'd hear footsteps in the hallway outside the East Wing, not heading to the office, just moving through the house, quieter than usual. Once, passing the sitting room door, she'd seen Alexandra standing at the window, looking out at the garden where Lily sometimes took Sophia in the afternoons, watching the last of the evening light drain away. Her coffee had gone cold in her hand. She hadn't seemed to notice. Lily understood the cost of loneliness because she had paid it herself. She knew what it did to a person over time, how it calcified around you quietly, hardening into something you eventually stopped feeling because you learned to mistake the numbness for strength. She had come very close to that numbness herself in the early months after Sophia's father had left, when the nights had been long and the money had been short and the future had seemed like a door she wasn't sure she had the key to. Sophia had been the key. Sophia had cracked her open again, had made her loud and alive and willing to feel the full weight of everything, the fear and the exhaustion and the wonder and the love so immense it sometimes made it difficult to breathe. Looking at Alexandra Hargrove, with her cold coffee and her garden watching and her bear left quietly in a corner, Lily thought, this woman needs a key too. And then she thought, it is absolutely not your business, Lily Santos. And she went back to work. But she thought it. It was a Wednesday in late October when the thing happened that no one could have planned for and no one afterward could quite stop thinking about. The morning had begun with a problem. Lily had arrived to find a message from the daycare on her phone, a water main issue. The facility closed for the day, no advance warning. She'd stood in the parking lot of the estate for 4 minutes doing rapid calculations. There was no backup. Her neighbor, who sometimes watched Sophia, was out of town. Her mother was in Manila. There was no one to call who could be there in time, and Alexandra's morning schedule, Lily knew it precisely because knowing it was part of her job, began with a 7 a.m. video call with an investor group in Tokyo. She had gone inside and prepared the coffee and decided she would simply need to keep Sophia extraordinarily quiet and hoped that the day would be manageable and that she would not lose this job over a water main that had chosen this particular Wednesday to fail. Alexandra had come down at 6:52, which was 8 minutes early, which meant something was already weighing on her. She'd stopped at the kitchen doorway. Sophia had been sitting in her corner with the bear and the elephant and a board book, unusually quiet herself, as though she sensed the tension in her mother's body and had decided to be cooperative. "Daycare closed," Lily said, before Alexandra could ask. "I'm sorry. I'll keep her in the East Wing. You won't hear a thing." Alexandra had looked at Sophia for a moment. Then she'd said, "She can stay here, in the kitchen or the sitting room. Whatever she needs." A beat. "You shouldn't have to keep her hidden." Lily had opened her mouth and closed it again. "Thank you," she'd managed. The Tokyo call had happened. Lily had heard the edges of it through the office door while she worked the downstairs hallway, calm, precise, confident, the voice of someone who knew the value of every word she spoke. It lasted 90 minutes. Sophia slept through 40 of them on the kitchen floor cushion Lily had fashioned from a folded blanket, the bear tucked under her arm. And then Sophia woke up. She woke up in the particular way she had, not with crying or fussing, but with a sudden bright alertness, like a lamp switching on. She sat up. She looked around. She picked up her elephant. And then, because the office door had opened and Alexandra was standing in the hallway with her laptop under one arm and reading glasses pushed up onto her hair, and an expression that said the call had been both successful and exhausting, because Alexandra was standing right there within Sophia's direct line of sight, Sophia did what Sophia did. She stared, with that particular focused intensity. The stare that had always meant she was categorizing something, filing it, reaching some internal conclusion. Alexandra looked back at her. That careful, uncertain look. The expression of someone who hadn't quite learned the grammar of this yet, but was trying. And this was the moment that would get retold, that would become the pivot around which everything else reorganized itself. Sophia raised one small arm, extended one small finger, pointed directly at Alexandra Hargrove, 33 years old, tech billionaire, patent holder, Fortune cover subject. And with perfect clarity, with the kind of definitive conviction that only a 2-year-old who has been absorbing language in silence for months can produce, when she finally decides it is time, Sophia spoke her very first words. "DooDoo," she said, firmly, conclusively, as though this were simply a fact she was reporting, like the color of the sky or the location of the bear. The silence that followed was absolute. Lily's mop handle hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Alexandra did not move. He stood in the hallway with her laptop and her reading glasses and stared at Sophia, who stared back with complete satisfaction, her arms still extended, fingers still pointing, as though awaiting confirmation that she had correctly identified the specimen. Then Alexandra laughed. It came out of her like something that had been stored under pressure, sudden and full and entirely unguarded, a laugh that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised Lily, a laugh that traveled through the whole first floor and came back off the marble and the cathedral ceilings and filled the house with a sound it perhaps had not heard in years. She laughed the way people laugh, when something has bypassed every defense they own and landed directly on the soft, unprotected center of them. She laughed until she had to set the laptop on the hallway table and press one hand to her sternum, and her eyes went bright with it, bright and wet and alive. Sophia watched this with great interest, and then apparently decided it was a positive response, because she nodded once, that same single satisfied nod she'd given after the graham cracker, and went back to her elephant. Lily was standing very still in the hallway, mop handle retrieved, cheeks blazing, mortified to a degree she had no adequate words for. "I am so incredibly sorry," she began. She hasn't said anything before. This is her first. I don't know where she She said her first words, Alexandra said, and her voice was still warm with the last of the laughter, still unguarded in a way that Lily had not heard before. In my house. Her first words were. She pressed her lips together, glanced at Sophia, back at Lily. She called me DooDoo. I am going to find a new position, Lily said. You're absolutely not, Alexandra said. And something in her voice, something certain and quiet, and completely unlike the professional tone Lily had heard for 3 months, made Lily go very still. Alexandra looked down at Sophia, who was now offering the elephant to the bear in some kind of diplomatic exchange. The laughter had settled into something softer on her face. Something that looked, if Lily was reading it correctly, and she usually was, like a kind of wonder. She talked, Alexandra said quietly, more to herself than to Lily. She finally talked. The word finally lodged in Lily's chest like something warm, because it meant Alexandra had been waiting, had noticed the silence, had been paying attention all along, in the way she paid attention to everything, carefully, quietly, without announcing it. Had been hoping maybe for exactly this. Section 4. The architecture of unlikely things. The days that followed felt different in a way Lily couldn't have explained to anyone who asked, because the differences were not the kind that announced themselves loudly. Nothing dramatic had changed. The boundary lines were still present, still carefully observed. Alexandra still worked 12 hours a day, though perhaps 10 sometimes, and occasionally 9. Lily still cleaned the floors and managed the groceries and kept the house in the state of perfect order that had been the terms of her employment. Sophia still woke at 6:30 and ate breakfast on the kitchen floor and communed with her elephant and her bear with great seriousness. But the shape of things had shifted. The air in the house moved differently. It started with the language. Sophia, having apparently been storing words for the entirety of her 2-year existence and simply waiting for the right moment to begin releasing them, proceeded after her inaugural declaration to produce approximately 4 to 6 new words per day with the disciplined output of someone who had a quota to meet.
Bear. Book.
Milk.
No. Go. Mine. Ma.
She said ma on a Thursday morning, and Lily had to excuse herself to the laundry room for 3 minutes to collect herself. She came back to find Alexandra sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor, cross-legged, in her work clothes, before a board meeting, because Sophia had apparently demanded company during a critical phase of elephant and bear diplomacy. Alexandra had looked up when Lily reappeared. Read something on her face. Said nothing, but her expression said, I understand. I kept watch. Lily had handed her a cup of coffee and kept moving. The board meeting happened. Alexandra returned home at 6 instead of 8, which was becoming a pattern. She knocked on the east wing door, actually knocked, with the particular care of someone who understood they were entering another person's space, and asked if Sophia might like to come to the sitting room. She had apparently acquired, from somewhere, a wooden shape sorter puzzle. The large kind, with painted primary colors and satisfying thick pieces. Sophia had walked to the sitting room without looking back, which was, Lily reflected, either a sign of great trust or a sign that she had always considered Alexandra's house her own territory and had simply been tolerating the formalities until now. Lily had followed. She sat on the far end of the sofa with a mending project she'd brought from the East Wing. Alexandra sat on the floor with Sophia and the shape sorter. And for 45 minutes, the sitting room contained the sound of wooden pieces against board and Sophia's running commentary. She was narrating constantly now, an inexhaustible stream of the words she'd been collecting, and Alexandra's voice underneath it, quiet and patient, asking questions she clearly didn't need the answers to and listening to the responses as though they were important. Star, Alexandra would say, holding up the yellow piece. Ta, Sophia would repeat and snatch it immediately.
Yes.
Exactly right. Lily kept her eyes on the mending and did not look at her employer's face because she was fairly certain that what was happening on her employer's face was something private and she respected private things. But she heard it, The gentleness in Alexandra's voice, the particular quality of attention she was giving this 2-year-old and her wooden puzzle, and the unmistakable sense that this was not a performance of someone doing something nice. This was someone receiving something necessary, being given, in the form of a small child's unguarded company, something she had been without for so long she might have stopped noticing the absence. One evening, the 3rd week of November, the lake going silver-gray with the early dark, Alexandra had come to find Lily in the kitchen where she was warming Sophia's dinner and asked, with the careful precision she applied to important requests, whether Lily would tell her about Sophia's father. Not intrusively, she'd said. Not if it was too personal. Only if Lily wanted. Lily had considered this for a moment. Then she had told her, the true version, not the abbreviated one she offered to people who only had capacity for a single sentence. The real version, with the texture of it. How she had loved someone who had not been able to love her back in the sustained, reliable way that parenthood required. How he had left before Sophia arrived and she had been angry and then sad, and then not okay, exactly, but operational again. How Sophia had made her operational. How Sophia had made everything make sense in a way that nothing before had managed. Alexandra had listened to all of it without interrupting. When Lily finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're extraordinary, you know. What you've made of this." Lily had kept her eyes on the stove. "She made it. I just showed up." "That's not as small as you're making it sound." And that had been the end of that conversation, except that it wasn't, because after that the conversations began happening more regularly, not formally, not scheduled, but as a natural feature of the shared mornings and occasional evenings. Alexandra talked about her company, the way people talk about something they are simultaneously devoted to and exhausted by, with a kind of love that had worn them down and couldn't imagine being without. She talked about growing up the youngest of 3 in a family where ambition was currency and silence was failure. She talked about the 12 years of building, the choices that had cost her things she hadn't fully accounted for, friendships, relationships, the ordinary accumulation of a life that wasn't measured in exits and funding rounds. She talked about loneliness carefully, the way people handle things that are still slightly raw.
But she talked about it.
And Lily, who had also been lonely in her way, who had also made choices that had cost her things, who had also built a life from the materials available rather than the materials she'd hoped for, Lily understood every word. Not because their circumstances were the same, because they were not, but because loneliness, she had come to believe, spoke the same language regardless of the square footage of the house it lived in. Sophia was the bridge. This small, serious, marvelously verbal 2-year-old who had chosen, on a Wednesday morning in October, to break a months-long silence by pointing at a billionaire and calling her DooDoo, who had, in the way that only children can manage, simply decided that the distance between these 2 women was unnecessary and inconvenient, and dissolved it without ceremony. December arrived the way it always does in the Pacific Northwest, quietly, in layers of gray and mist, the lake going still and mirror-flat in the cold mornings, and the pines on the estate's east border holding their deep green against the pale sky. Lily had grown up in weather that never required a coat, and she had never quite made peace with winter here, but she had come to appreciate the particular intimacy of it, the way cold drew people inward, toward warmth, toward each other, in ways that bright seasons sometimes didn't. The Hargrove estate had never, in Lily's 3 months there, been decorated for the holidays. She had noted this without comment in the same way she noted everything, filed it, understood that it was not her place to remark upon. But on the second Saturday of December, she had come in from the morning to find Alexandra in the attic, actually in the attic, which Lily had never known anyone to access, with the door folded down and the retractable stairs extended and boxes being handed down at intervals to no one in particular, because no one was there to receive them. Lily had stood at the base of the stairs and said, "What are you looking for?" "Christmas decorations." Alexandra's voice came from somewhere deep in Eve. "I know they're here. My mother sent them 2 years ago. I told her I would put them up. I never did. I don't." A pause. The sound of boxes being shifted. "Sophia should have a Christmas." Lily had stood there for a moment with all the things she might have said moving through her like weather, choosing none of them. Then she climbed the stairs and started helping. They'd found the decorations, 4 medium-sized boxes, carefully packed, labeled in handwriting that Lily recognized from the framed holiday card on Alexandra's office bookshelf as the handwriting of a mother who paid careful attention to the small details of things. Inside, ornaments wrapped in tissue paper, a string of warm white lights, a small wooden nativity set, and at the bottom of the 4th box, a single knit stocking with a name cross-stitched into the cuff in red thread. Alexandra. Alexandra had taken it from Lily's hands without comment, held it for a moment, then set it carefully with the other items and carried the box downstairs. They had decorated the house that afternoon, Lily and Alexandra and Sophia, who had appointed herself official ornament inspector and taken her responsibilities with characteristic gravity. The tree they'd retrieved from a lot in town, a 7-foot Douglas fir that deposited needles in a trail from the front door to the corner of the living room where it eventually stood in a stand that required 3 attempts and collaborative problem-solving to stabilize. Sophia had supervised all of this from the safety of her bear and elephant's position on the couch, offering a running commentary that was approximately 50% comprehensible and 100% earnest. "Tea," she said, pointing at the tree. "Tree," Alexandra confirmed. "Big tea. Very big tree." "DooDoo's tea," Sophia said, with complete satisfaction. There was a beat of silence. "She's decided this is my tree," Alexandra said, her voice carefully controlled, though Lily could see the corner of her mouth. "I'm very sorry," Lily said, also carefully. "Please stop apologizing for things that I am," Alexandra paused, "that I find very funny, and other things." Sophia had fallen asleep that evening on the living room couch under the light of the tree, the warm white lights turning the room amber and soft, her face absolutely peaceful, the bear in her arms and the elephant tucked under her chin, because a 2-year-old's comfort system required redundancy. Alexandra had stood looking at her for a moment, and then had turned to Lily and said, very quietly, "Thank you for bringing her here."
"I didn't have a choice about it," Lily said.
"Daycare?" "Not that day," Alexandra said. "Here. To this house." A pause. "To me." Lily had held that sentence for a long moment, turned it over in her hands. The professional boundary was right there. She could feel its edge, the careful line she'd maintained for months, the line that made sense and was appropriate and protected them both. And she thought about Sophia asleep under the tree, and the knit stocking with the cross-stitched name, and 11 minutes of lake staring every morning that had gradually become 17, and a box of animal crackers on the lower pantry shelf, and a cloth bear with a red ribbon left without explanation in a corner. And the way Alexandra's laugh had sounded on a Wednesday morning in October, when a 2-year-old had called her DooDoo and cracked open something that had been closed a very long
time.
"She chose you," Lily said finally. "I just followed her lead." Alexandra looked at her. In the amber light of the Christmas tree, with her hair loose, she'd taken it down to hang lights, and hadn't put it back up, and the formal composure she wore like armor set aside for the evening. She looked young. She looked like someone who was both exactly who she appeared to be, and also, underneath that, something more uncertain and more hopeful and more human than the person on the fortune cover had suggested. "I think," Alexandra said carefully, "that maybe she wasn't the only one making a choice." The tree lights hummed. Outside, The first snow of December had begun to fall against the windows, soft and unhurried. Sophia slept and breathed and held her bear. On Christmas morning, Sophia woke up at 5:48, which, Lily reflected, was consistent with her general position that sleep was a waste of time that could be better used for activities. She sat up in the East Wing room with her bear and said, with great energy, "Go, go, go, go," which was her current preferred method of expressing urgency. Lily had been awake already. She was always awake first. She dressed Sophia in the red velvet dress she'd saved for 2 months to afford. It had a white lace collar, and Sophia had approved it during an at-home fashion review by pointing at herself in the mirror and saying "pretty," which had been one of Lily's favorite moments of the year, and they had gone down the hallway to the living room. Alexandra was already there. This was, perhaps, the thing Lily would remember most precisely. Alexandra standing in the living room at 5:50 in the morning, in pajamas, barefoot, with the Christmas tree lights on and a cup of coffee held in both hands and a pile of gifts under the tree that had appeared overnight, wrapped carefully in silver paper with red ribbons. She'd been awake early, too. She'd put out the gifts herself, in the dark, in the quiet. She'd been waiting. Sophia walked directly to her. No hesitation. No checking back with her mother. She crossed the room the way she always moved toward the things she had decided belonged to her, with complete certainty, and she stopped in front of Alexandra and lifted both arms in the gesture that meant up. Alexandra set down her coffee and picked her up, both arms, easily, naturally, as though she had done this 1,000 times. Sophia settled against her shoulder and looked at the tree and said, "Oh," in a soft, wondering voice, and Alexandra looked at Lily over Sophia's dark hair with an expression that contained, all at once, more than Lily had the precise words for. It was gratitude and wonder, and something that had been kept in a very small, closed room for a very long time, and had only recently learned that rooms could open. The morning happened around them in the warm and glowing way of good mornings that know what they are. Sophia tore into her gifts with the methodical enthusiasm of someone who understood that ritual mattered, not rushing, but savoring, examining each thing, providing commentary. A new stuffed animal, a set of board books, a wooden play kitchen small enough for the East Wing room. From Alexandra, a delicate gold bracelet with Sophia's name engraved on a tiny charm, too small to wear yet, but sized for a wrist that would grow into it, kept in a small velvet box that Sophia opened and closed approximately 16 times in a row, because the mechanism delighted her. "She won't be able to wear that for a while," Lily said. "I know," Alexandra said. "It's for when she's bigger." For when she's bigger. A statement about the future. A statement that assumed the future would be here, and they would be in it together. Lily felt the shape of that sentence settle somewhere inside her, quiet and certain and permanent. She had a gift for Alexandra, too, carefully chosen, modest in cost, maximal in meaning. She'd found it at a small bookshop downtown, a first edition of The Velveteen Rabbit, its cover worn in a different place than the copy on the nightstand, its pages smelling of the particular old book smell that meant someone had loved it thoroughly. On the inside cover she had written, in her careful handwriting, "To the woman who let us into her house, and then into something much more important than that. Lily and Sophia." Alexandra read it sitting on the floor of the living room with Sophia in her lap, and she did not say anything for a moment, and her eyes, when she looked up, were bright in the way they had been on that October morning, alive and undefended and entirely herself. "This is the best gift I've ever received," she said. Simply, like a fact. The day unfolded in a way that good days do, without forcing, without agenda, in the natural rhythm of people who have found something easy and true in each other's company. They made breakfast together, which involved Sophia attempting to stir pancake batter and achieving a result that was ambitious in scope and challenging in execution. They ate at the dining room table, which had been cleared of its overflow desk materials for the first time since Lily had arrived. They walked to the lake in the early afternoon, the snow from the previous week still thin and bright on the ground. Sophia bundled into her red coat and insisted on holding both of their hands for the entirety of the walk, which meant Lily and Alexandra walked side by side with a 2-year-old suspended between them, her feet occasionally lifting off the ground when she decided she preferred to be carried by momentum. It was on this walk, their breath visible in the cold air, the lake silver and still and enormous before them, Sophia swinging contentedly between their held hands, that Alexandra said the things she had been, Lily suspected, moving toward for some time. "I'd like you to stop thinking of yourself as my employee," she said.
Carefully.
With the precise care she gave to things that mattered. "I mean, you'll still be paid, obviously. That's not, I mean in terms of how you think about this. About us." Lily looked at the lake. "How do you mean, then?" "I mean, I want you here because you're a pause. Because you're you. And because she's her. Not because of the job." Another pause. "I want to figure out what this is. What we are." She glanced at Lily. "If you want that too." Sophia chose this moment to announce up with considerable force, and the conversation paused while she was redistributed to Alexandra's arms, from which she surveyed the lake with an expression of great authority, the empress of the shoreline, entirely satisfied with the state of things. Lily thought about the 5:30 mornings and the carefully maintained boundaries and the invisible lines she'd drawn around herself, because lines were how you survived in spaces that weren't built for you. She thought about the cost of those lines, the safety they provided, and the things they kept out. She thought about Sophia, who had never learned to draw those lines, who had simply walked into a space and decided it was hers and the woman in it was hers, and that was the end of it, and had said so, loudly, with her first words in the whole world. She thought, maybe I have been the last one to learn what my daughter knew from the beginning. "Yes," Lily said. "I want that too." The lake held their reflection, a woman and a child between them, small against the wide winter sky, the three of them standing at the edge of something enormous and beautiful and entirely new. Sophia pointed at a heron standing at the water's edge, the same kind of heron, maybe the same one, that had stood there on that very first morning, considering something important. "Bird," Sophia said.
Clearly.
Definitively. "Bird," Alexandra confirmed. Sophia looked at her, that long, serious look, and then reached out and patted her cheek with one small cold hand, gently, in the way she had recently begun to do with the things and the people she loved best. It was her version of "I know you. I chose you. You are mine, and I am yours, and that is simply the truth of things." Alexandra caught Lily's eyes over Sophia's head, and they stood there, the three of them, at the edge of the winter lake, in the particular silence that isn't empty at all, the kind that is so full it doesn't need anything added to it, the kind that sounds, if you know how to listen, like the beginning of something. Sophia's first words had been absurd and perfect and entirely her. They had cracked open a house that had forgotten how to be a home, had introduced two lonely people to the possibility of being less lonely, had dissolved a distance that neither woman would have known how to dissolve on her own. The little girl with the serious eyes and the bear with the red ribbon and the unshakable certainty about which things and people belonged to her had looked at a billionaire in a hallway and called her DooDoo and changed everything. And somewhere in the careful architecture of what came next, the shared mornings and the growing vocabulary and the life building itself quietly in the spaces between two women who had each, in their own way, been waiting for something like this, Sophia grew into her name bracelet. And the house, finally learned how to echo with the right kind of sound. The end.